All right, we have a lot to talk about. So if I can figure out how to do this, we will start. Does everybody recognize this bird? Does anybody recognize this bird?
No.
This is the resplendent quetzal. It's an endangered species from Central America. You don't have quetzals if you don't have fruits from the wild avocado tree, because that is a major part of their diet. And the problem is we have cut down the wild avocado trees, so the quetzals are disappearing. We've figured out, though, that if you replant the wild avocado trees, they grow up, make fruits, and you can actually save the quetzal. It's starting to look better for the quetzals. These plants grow fairly quickly, and in not too many years they'll be making fruits, and the quetzal comes back. And that conservation scenario is very common, particularly in the tropics. If you want to save the great green macaw, you have to have mountain almond trees, because that's the only place they will nest. And this scenario is not quite so rosy. There's very few of these left, and it takes about 150 years to get the trees to the size where they will use them. So they are starting to plant them now, but we hope that the few birds that are left can hang on that long. If you want to save jaguars, then you have to have a particular species of palm. And that's not quite as obvious. Why? Because they make a particular type of palm nut, and that palm nut is the favorite food of peccaries. And you don't have jaguars without healthy peccary populations. So what's common about all these examples is that these are specialized relationships, and specialization in the natural world is the rule. It is not the exception, particularly specialization that focuses on food resources. And they always start with plants. Now, a lot of people think that specialization really occurs mostly in the tropics, and it certainly does occur in the tropics. Tons of specialized relationships in tropical regions. That includes Florida, by the way. But it's also very common in temperate regions. And some of the most specialized relationships that have ever occurred, that we know about, occur right in my yard. Right in your yards too. This is the bola spider. It's called the bola spider because this is a female. She's hanging from a river birch leaf off my back porch, and she's strapped a single strand of thread and puts a little single glob of glue on the end, which looks like a bolus. And she doesn't swing it around like this. She goes fishing. She raises it and lowers it and raises it, just the way I used to fish when I didn't catch anything. And the first time I saw this, I told her, "You're not going to catch anything either. There's no way you're going to catch anything doing that." But about 15 seconds later, a moth flew right into that bolus, and she wheeled it in and then wrapped it up and laid her eggs on it. And I learned later that that was not an accident. She actually was emitting the sex pheromone of that moth. That's a male moth. He thought he was flying into a female of his species, and he was wrong. But she has mimicked the actual chemical formula of his complex sex pheromone. And every species of bola spider that we have in this country, actually in the world, mimics the sex pheromone of a single species of moth. But you're not going to have bola spiders in your yard if you don't have the host plant that supports the larva of the moth that they are mimicking, of the moth's sex pheromone. So again, it gets back to plants. This is Phlox tubericata, very popular native plant in our spring ephemeral gardens up north, and it spreads easily by seed if it's pollinated. But if you look at those corollas, really tiny little holes. I've watched native bees land on these flowers, try to get their tongues in there, and they can't do it. So what is pollinating our Phlox tubericata? Well, it turns out it's day-flying sphinx moths. And this is the hummingbird sphinx. There's its tongue. He's aiming for the little hole. Goes deep inside the little hole. And when he pulls it out, it is covered with pollen. Then he flies to another flower, and they're excellent pollinators of this particular plant species. But you won't have the hummingbird sphinx moth in your yard if you don't have the larval host plant. That's the larva, and that happens to be native viburnums. In my yard, that's Viburnum dentatum. And we have a number of specialized relationships that rely on crypsis, the ability to hide into or blend into your background. There's a caterpillar right there. There it is, a little bit more obvious. This is the cloudless sulfur on a partridge pea. There are a number of small legumes that make yellow flowers like this, and that's what these caterpillars eat and specialize on. And you can see what happens if they're not in that flower. They become very obvious, and they're picked off right away. This is mayapple. It's a common ground cover up north in the spring, and it reproduces sexually with a nice little flower there that then makes a little fruit. But what most people don't know is that if that fruit is not eaten by a box turtle, the seeds won't germinate. So you can have May apples in your yard, but they will not propagate sexually unless you have box turtles as well. So you've got a specialized interaction there. And then even animals we don't think of as having specialized relationships with plants actually do. And this is an example. This is the Carolina chickadee. We all think of chickadees as seed eaters because they're at our feeders all winter long eating seeds. So they are seed eaters. But when they reproduce, which happens to be a very important part of their life history, they are caterpillar eaters. They're not feeding their babies seeds, they're feeding them caterpillars. Now they could, it's not because caterpillars are the only things they could find. There are early season grasshoppers they could take, there are early season crickets they could take, there are mayflies, there are syrphid flies, there are snake flies, there are psychedelic leafhoppers and click beetles and caddisflies and sow bugs and centipedes and millipedes and spiders and many other things that they could be feeding their young, but they don't take any of them. They only take caterpillars. So that means that if you live in a place that doesn't have enough caterpillars, or doesn't have caterpillars, you're not going to have chickadees. And actually I was right the first time. Having almost enough caterpillars is not good enough. You have to have enough to be able to support reproduction by this particular bird. So how much is enough? How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? Well, that's a good question. It takes a lot. And it was actually this pair that convinced me of that. I put up a little nest box in my backyard and then set up my camera so I could take pictures of what they were bringing in. And the first thing I learned is that the male and the female cooperate with each other when they're foraging, which means they can bring a caterpillar back to the nest once every 3 minutes. In one 27-minute period, they brought back 30 caterpillars. How do they do that? By bringing back more than one at a time. Sometimes a whole bunch. And they do that from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., so they're doing that all day long. Now, sometimes they bring back an adult caterpillar, a moth, but that's uncommon. That is rare. So typically, it's the caterpillar itself. Now, this is another important part of the story. In a 3-hour period, they brought back 17 species of caterpillars. Now, chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. So they're foraging in the plants in your yard, and actually in trees. They don't go to the ground, they're up in trees. If you only have 1 or 2 species of caterpillars in your yard, even if they're common one year, the next year they won't be. The populations fluctuate. But if you have 17 species, or a lot more than that, in my case, I don't know how many species we have in our yard, hundreds. There's always going to be something that's common enough to support this intense foraging by chickadees. Now, if we go to the book and we look up how many chickadees, or how many caterpillars a chickadee brings back to the nest every day, it's between 390 and 570. And they do that for 16 to 18 days. That's the average time to fledging. So if we get out our calculators, that's between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadees. And chickadees are tiny birds, a third of an ounce. I think that's 4 pennies. What if we wanted to make red-bellied woodpeckers? They're 8 times bigger than chickadees. How many caterpillars does that take? And of course, we don't want just chickadees and red-bellied woodpeckers in our yard. We want a whole complex community of birds and other things that eat insects. We want titmice, and we want what is that? A blue jay. We want blue jays. We want yellowthroats, we want bluebirds, we want indigo bunnies, and we want prairie warblers, we want hummingbirds, we want all kinds of birds. Speaking of hummingbirds, what's the specialized relationship here? Nectar. Nectar. No. That's what we all think. What do? We put up hummingbird feeders that are filled with sugar water. And of course, hummingbirds do take nectar, but 80% of their diet is insects and spiders. You don't have hummingbirds if you don't have the insects and spiders that make hummingbirds. As a matter of fact, hummingbirds are just typical of most of the birds that are out there. This is a list of the terrestrial bird families in North America that rear their young on insects. And the book will say other arthropods, and those other arthropods are the spiders that needed insects to become spiders. 96% of our birds are rearing their young on insect protein. We're so used to thinking of birds eating seeds and berries. And of course, many birds do need seeds and berries during particular times of their life. But when they're making more birds, which is a really important time, they need insects. So if we only supply seeds and berries and no insects, we're not going to have any birds at all. That's it. No insects, no baby birds. So let's talk about what type of landscape is going to make the diversity and abundance of insects that is required to maintain food webs that support common things like birds. Well, to answer that question, we have to consider the relationship, the specialized relationship between the insects that eat plants and the plants themselves. One of the most specialized collection of relationships that have ever evolved. You have to remember that plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they have loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make the tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And this is an extremely common defense. Every plant out there has some type of chemical defense in its tissues. And it's very successful. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why when we look outside up north, we look at during the summertime, it is green, not because there's nothing that wants to eat those plants, but because most of those plants are inedible. They are unavailable to things that want to eat them. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around these chemical defenses? Well, they specialize. 90% of the insects that eat plants have highly specialized diets on typically one lineage of plant, sometimes a few that share the same type of chemical defense. But it's just a small number of plants compared to what's available to them. So if I'm an insect, I say, over evolutionary time, I'm going to get good at eating this particular type of plant. I'm going to develop the enzymes and the physiological mechanisms and the life history adaptations and the behavioral adaptations that allow me to eat this plant without dying. But for all those adaptations to fall into place, it takes a long period of exposure to that particular plant lineage. This does not happen overnight. Here's an example. This is eastern red cedar. Now you've got southern red cedar down here. Same thing is happening on that plant. It's been very successful at defending its tissues. There are relatively few insects that have been able to get around what it uses. It uses a toxic monoterpene called beta-thuyoplixin. So most insects cannot eat cedars, but this is one that can. This is the juniper hairstreak. It is a specialist on eastern red cedar. And I don't know if it gets on southern red cedar. I bet it does. Think you have butterfly people here? I'll have to look that up. But this is a specialist. It has developed the enzymes and all of those adaptations that allow it to eat beta-thuyoplixin without dying. And that's the upside of specializing. Now it can eat a plant and have very little competition from other insects that can't eat this plant. The downside of specializing is that now that's all it can eat. So by developing the adaptations that allow it to get around beta-thuyoplixin, it has not developed adaptations that allow it to get around cucurbitacins that are in cucurbits or cyanide that's in a lot of our peaches and other things. All of the defense of nicotine that's in our tobaccos, those are all chemical defenses, and this insect can't eat any of them. So that means if we don't include cedars in our landscapes, we will lose this butterfly. If you're going to eat eastern red cedar, you might as well look like it. Everybody see the caterpillar there? Right there?
Oh my gosh.
Here it is up close. This is called crypsis, and of course they're blending in with their background. This particular species is called the curved-lined angle, and my chickadees brought back 2 of them, so they can find these guys. They're really good at finding caterpillars. I showed this picture to my wife, and I said, "Can you find the caterpillar?" She said, "Oh yes." And I said, "Yeah, that one's easy." She said, "Oh, I didn't see that one. I saw this one that I didn't see when I took the picture." There are 2 in this picture. We've got one hiding right in here, and we've got a little sphinx moth right in there. And you can even be cryptic on the dead parts of cedars. This is the juniper geometer right there that's blending in very well with the dead needles. So fun with crypsis. But specialization, well, as we know, is common, and it actually can be a curse as well, because, as I said, if you only eat one plant and that plant is not used in the landscape, then you're going to disappear. And that's exactly what's happening to our poor monarchs. You probably have heard about the sad state of the migrating populations of monarchs. There are only 3.6% of the monarchs today compared to 1976 when they were found overwintering in Mexico. And that is because they are specialists on milkweed, and we are removing milkweed from our landscapes, particularly in the Midwest, where we have adopted clean farming techniques. We use Roundup Ready corn and soybeans, so there are no more milkweeds popping up among the rows. And okay, I can accept that. They want to up the yields, but they also are spraying everything outside of the the fields. And these used to be loaded with milkweeds and other blooming plants. So we get to see the monarch disappear. But what we're not watching are all the native bees. We have 4,000 species of native bees, and they need flowering plants all summer long. Nothing there. We have tens of thousands of square miles of the Midwest that are biological deserts right now, and that's what's doing in the monarchs. So the homeowners of the Midwest now have a very important job. Very quickly, they've got to get as many milkweeds into their landscapes as possible, or the monarch will truly disappear. It's the most iconic insect in the world, and we're watching it go extinct so that we can have clean farming terrains. But it's not just caterpillars that are specialists. As I said, most of the insects that eat plants are specialists. This is the elderberry beetle that only eats elderberry. This is the dogbane beetle, only eats dogbane. Sumac flea beetle only eats sumac. This is a Korean bug, a leaf-footed bug that only eats ash. So if any of you have heard of the emerald ash borer up north that is killing all the ashes, if it does kill all of the ashes, this species will disappear. The great ash sphinx will disappear. The wave sphinx will disappear. I think there's 44 species of caterpillars that are specialists on ashes. They will all disappear, and that gets back to this 90%. If we load the landscape with plants from other places, from outside of our local food webs, that's what a non-native plant is, or an introduced plant, we're going to lose 90% of the insects that are specializing on native plant communities. But we can use this knowledge that most things are specialists to actually reconstruct food webs if we understand how those food webs are put together. So this is a little exercise to show us how we could build a food web to support white-eyed vireos. My wife found this nest in our yard last summer, so I was out there with my camera seeing what they were feeding their babies. And one of the things they brought back was the blinded sphinx, which happens to be a specialist on black cherry. So now we know that black cherry was contributing that meal to that baby chick. This is the chestnut schizura. It's called the chestnut schizura because it's actually a viburnum specialist. That's the problem with common names. So we already know I've got viburnum dentatum in my yard because we've got the hummingbird sphinx. Well, we also have the chestnut schizura, so the babies get to eat again. This is the drab prominent. A lot of people say, now how do you know that? Well, look at the white line right down the back. Only drab prominents have the white line. And it's a specialist on sycamore. So yes, we have sycamores, they get to eat again. This is the 8-spotted forester moth, a specialist on native grapes. This is the lunate zale, which is another specialist on black cherry. So our black cherries are contributing more than one species to this food web. This is the spicebush swallowtail. There's a little eye there that is supposed to convince the bird that it's a tree snake and it'll be scared. Didn't work. It's a specialist on spicebush and sassafras, which are related. And this is the tufted bird-dropping moth, which is another specialist on black cherry. So black cherry is really important to the food web of this particular bird. But these guys are hungry. They need a lot more than that. So if we have some black walnuts in our yard, we can have walnut sphinxes. We can have the gray-edged boma loca. We can have the black blotch caesura. We can have the bride. Those are all specialists on black cherry. If we have native maples, we can have Plagodes inchworms and green-striped mapleworm and the retarded dagger moth. native elms, like this is the American elm, we can have the four-horned sphinx, the double-toothed prominent. If we want deer in our yards, never mind. What about violets? I don't know about you folks if you have violets down here, but this is the only host plant for true fritillaries. Your Gulf fritillary is a beautiful butterfly, but it's not a true fritillary. And it eats passion vine. But our true fritillaries up north only eat violets. And what do we do with our violets in the spring? They come up in our yard, we mow them down. But those caterpillars of most of the species of fritillaries overwinter as larvae. So they're on those early spring violets, and when we mow them down, we've just chopped up all the fritillaries. So yeah, 90% of the insects, I can't say this too many times, are not going to be in our yards, they're not going to be in any biological corridors we create if we don't put the plants that they depend on in those spaces. So if we want the hackberry butterfly, hackberry emperor, we need hackberry. If we want Coculio asteroides, we need native asters. If we want the brown-hooded owlet, we need goldenrod. If we want the hog sphinx or the Pandora sphinx or the abbot sphinx, they're all specialists on Virginia creeper. If we want the river birch dagger moth, yes, we need river birch. And our pawpaw specialists, the zebra swallowtail and the pawpaw sphinx, are only going to be in your yard if you have pawpaw. The large pectes and the luna moth depend on the senior moment plan. Sweet gum, thank you. Gray furcula on native willows. The turbulent phosphilla, you can't tell which end is which. It's on smilax, on greenbrier. And the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the southern oak dagger moth, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the streaked dagger moth, and the laugher, and dozens more are specialists on oaks. And of course, I could go on and on and on. You've got a lot of plants out there, and each one has its own group of specialists associated with it. So why do we want all these insects? Because it's not just birds that eat insects. Almost everything out there depends on insect protein. All of our spiders are eating insects. Yes, you don't like spiders, I see that. But you know who does like spiders? That's the second most important component of bird food webs. This is the prothonotary warbler. They really like spiders. Our predatory insects are eating the insect herbivores that would disappear if we don't have the right plants. And we have thousands of species of insect predators that are out there that would disappear. Our frogs depend on insects. We have frogs, our toads, all of our amphibians depend on insects for food. Even our freshwater fish. 60% of the protein that drives freshwater fish populations comes from terrestrial insects that fall into the water. So if you line your streams with something like Japanese knotweed is common up in our area, nothing falls into the water, and it really hurts these fish populations. Our lizards eat insects, our bats eat insects, even our rodents eat insects. We always think of rodents as seed eaters, because of course they are seed eaters when they can't find enough insects. But the reason they want insects is because insects are really good food. Pound for pound, there's twice as much protein in insect meat as there is in beef, and insects have organs in their abdomen called fat bodies that are loaded with lipids, with fats that allow these guys to grow quickly and reproduce quickly, which if you're a mouse you want to do because there's a lot of things that want to eat you out there. Same reason that larger organisms are eating insects. They're just really good food. The skunk is digging up your yard to get the grubs that are in your yard. Possums eat a lot of insects. Raccoons eat a lot of insects. And even things we don't think of as insectivores eat a lot of insects. 25% of a red fox's diet is insects. 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. And even things that don't eat insects require insects. This is the sharp-shinned hawk, and of course it is a bird predator, even though I do have a picture of it with a dragonfly in its talons. Most of the time it's eating birds, and you might think, well, I can have sharp-shinned hawks in my neighborhood even if I have no insects. But think about it, the birds that it's eating needed insects to become birds. So this guy is indirectly tied to the health of its local insect community. So what is happening to all of these insectivores, the species that rely on insects? I can give you lots of nasty statistics, but I have learned long ago that people have a limited ability to absorb bad news, and after that, just turn off. So we're just going to give you one slide here. Does anybody know what that bird is? Good for you. Good for you. Most audiences don't know, and I don't blame them because their population has decreased 96%. We've lost 96% of our bobolinks, and they're just one of 127 species of neotropical migrants, the birds that breed in North America, then move to Central and South America for the winter, that are in decline. And that's about half of them. We now have 50% fewer birds today than we had just 40 years ago, and that's birds of all kinds. Birds, of course, are ecological indicators. If their ecosystems are in such bad shape that they are disappearing, our ecosystems are in bad shape too. It's the same set of ecosystems, so we need to pay attention to that. A world without insects is a world without biological diversity, and a world without biological diversity is a world without humans. So this is where we need to pay attention to this. These messages really aren't optional. Now, we can measure what happens when we take native plant communities out of a particular space and replace them with a hodgepodge of plants from around the world. What happens to local food webs? We've done this experiment a number of different times in controlled common garden experiments, or if we simply walk into hedgerows like you see right here and measure caterpillars. So this was a senior thesis project for a student at the University of Delaware, Melissa Richard, and what she did was go to hedgerows in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and she measured the caterpillars in a standardized way that were being produced by that hedgerow. Now, some of these hedgerows were invaded by invasive species, by plants from someplace else. This one has been invaded by autumn olive, genus Elaeagnus. It was a plant brought over as an ornamental about 120 years ago. Has since escaped and is now what we call an invasive species. Folks in South Carolina hate this plant so much they call it ugly Agnes, and I kind of like that name. But you know, if ugly Agnes invades this hedgerow, but it's the ecological equivalent of the native plants that it's displacing, then it wouldn't matter. Our hedgerows would look like ugly Agnes, but they still would be just as productive. So that's what we're measuring here. Is ugly Agnes as good at making caterpillars as the plants that used to be there? It's not just ugly Agnes there. It's multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and miscanthus and ailanthus and Norway maple and barberry and burning bush and privet and you name it. And you know what? They're all escapees from our gardens. And we compare the caterpillars to uninvaded hedgerows where we have almost entirely native plants. What did we find? Melissa found 5 times more species of caterpillars in the uninvaded hedgerows, and 22 times more caterpillars themselves, which means that the plants that are largely from Asia are very poor at making caterpillars. And remember, these are invaded hedgerows, so there were some native plants there. It could be that those caterpillars are all from the native plants. So we know that non-native plants are not very good at making caterpillars. The question is, do we care about that? Does that matter? And the answer is it matters, again, if you eat caterpillars, like so many of our birds do. This is the common yellowthroat. It's a male. He's trying to feed his babies in the ground over here. And if he's in a habitat that's overrun with ugly Agnes and her friends, he's going to have 22 times fewer caterpillars to forage from. And some people have suggested, well, let him forage 22 times harder, and it'll be okay. But, you know, he's already foraging all day long.
Yeah, right.
156 trips a day, 1 trip every 5 minutes. He can't do that 22 times harder. So the prediction is there'll be 22 times less bird biomass in an area where you've taken away that much food. What happens in our ornamental plantings, in the gardens in our neighborhoods where we've chosen ornamentals that are largely non-native? Well, we have measured this in a different way. We've gone to Michael Durr's Manual for Woody Landscape Plants. He recommends that we landscape with 69 genera of let's call them out-of-towners, plants from someplace else. But 101 genera of in-towners, of plants that belong here. And then we went to the literature and we looked up the number of species of caterpillars recorded on each one of these plant genera. And in general, there were 4 species able to eat the out-of-town ornamentals, and 72 species able to eat the in-town ornamentals, which means if we landscape primarily with these guys, we're losing a tremendous diversity and abundance of caterpillars in our yards. And of course, gardeners get that. They don't want caterpillars in their yard. That's why they've chosen these plants, because they're pest-free. But we'll talk about that in a minute. How different can plants actually be at supporting food webs? We have created this list. This is a list of the woody plant genera in the mid-Atlantic states, and the numbers in the parentheses after each plant genus are the number of species of caterpillars recorded in the literature as being able to make a living on that particular plant. So we have all of the native plant genera here, and also all of the invasive species, the naturalized plant genera. And they're ranked from the best to the worst. Now, these are the woody plants. We also have all of the herbaceous plants ranked. The reason we did this is so that we can actually pick out any 2 plant genera and compare their ability to support food webs. So as I go around the country and show people this list, they say, where's the list for Florida? Where's the list for Mississippi? And I say, we don't have one. It took us 2 years to make that list. But the good news is, the Forest Service is actually funding our lab to make a list for every state in the union this year, and they want it by Christmas. So if we're successful, and by we I mean Kimberly Shrupshire is the person slaving over this as I speak, you'll have a list for Florida by Christmas, so that will be great. What are we going to do with this? Well, let's look at number 1, oaks. Quercus. You've got so many wonderful live oaks and other species of oaks down here. My prediction is they also will be number 1. But this will be one of the interesting things we can compare. Are the same plants as productive as you move around the country? 557 species of caterpillars, 557 species of bird food recorded on oaks just in the mid-Atlantic states, compared to, here's Brazilian pepper. 5 species have been recorded on Brazilian pepper. And of course, that's an invasive species from South America. So 557 versus 5, big difference. This is number 2 on our list, native prunus. You've got a number of native prunus down here. We mostly have black cherry up where I come from. 456 species of bird food on native prunus, compared to something like Zelkova, which is commonly planted to replace the elms that have died from Dutch elm disease, because it looks like an elm. 0. Nothing on that. So you're trading 456 for 0 when we plant Zelkova. Pieris japonica, a very common foundation plant up north, 2 species recorded on it, compared to native viburnums that have 103 species. There are tremendous differences between plants. So when we choose a plant for our yard, the plant we choose actually is critically important to whether or not we're going to maintain the food web in that yard. We're not doing a very good job at that. As a matter of fact, not just in our ornamental plantings, but in 75% of the ecosystems around the world, there are so many invasive plants or plants that we have moved around in those ecosystems now, ecologists are calling them novel ecosystems. So all over the world, we've created novel ecosystems, which simply means the organisms in those ecosystems are evolutionarily novel. They have not been together long enough to develop the specialized relationships that are in nature, that I was talking about in the beginning. If you eliminate all the specialized relationships out there, you don't have very much left. And that's exactly what a novel ecosystem has done. So, at least locally, species are disappearing from our novel ecosystems. They're disappearing from our yards. Does that matter? Does that matter? And when people think of extinction, they always think about global extinction. But remember, ecosystems function locally. If lions disappear from Africa, is that really going to affect your life? Probably not. But the African ecosystem is not running your life. The ecosystem right around you here in Jacksonville is running your life. So think about your own yard, and think about the number of species that are there today compared to the number of species that were there, 200 years ago. If you have fewer species in your yard today, does that matter? Well, ecologists have been asking that question for years, since the 50s as a matter of fact. The first person to come up with a hypothesis about the relationship between the number of species in an ecosystem and ecosystem function was Robert MacArthur. And this was what he said. He said, as you increase the number of species in an ecosystem, ecosystem function goes up. And I think he left it at that. But of course, you can reverse that. As you decrease the number of species in an ecosystem, then ecosystem function goes down. It's very difficult to test these hypotheses in real ecosystems. You don't even know how many species are there. You can't manipulate them. So he didn't test it. He simply called it the law of nature, and everybody believed him, and it sounded good. Several hypotheses have been advanced since then, and some of them sounded just as good. So we weren't sure which was happening and which wasn't. But 3 studies came out in 2012 where they did have long-term experiments where they created ecosystems, knew all the species that were in them, manipulated them, and 3 different independent studies all said the same thing. Whoops. And that was that Robert MacArthur was right. They're all suggesting that as you increase the number of species in an ecosystem, ecosystem function goes up, and as you decrease the number of species, ecosystem function goes down. So how many species do we need in our ecosystems? We need all of them. Why? Because we need as much ecosystem function as we can possibly get. Why? Because it is the species in our ecosystems that are driving those ecosystems, and it's those ecosystems that are making the ecosystem services that keep humans alive. There was a huge study, and it came out in 2005, took them 5 years to do it. Hundreds of scientists from around the world. They had a number of goals, but the most important one was to measure it was called the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment. They wanted to measure the ability of the Earth to produce ecosystem services and see whether humans have degraded that ability or not. And their conclusion was, an unhappy conclusion, is that we have already degraded 60% of the Earth's ability to make the ecosystem services that support human populations. So that's not good news, because every time we add a person to the planet, we're doing that 3 times a second. I think we get 1 million people every 4.5 days additional on the planet. We need more ecosystem services, not fewer. But every time we add people to the planet, we're getting fewer. So that's a relationship we need to turn around ASAP. What is an ecosystem service? Quick review. How about about the production of oxygen. We don't think about that. Did you think about whether you'd have enough oxygen this afternoon when you woke up this morning? I always forget to do that. And we don't think about it because we say oxygen has always been here, but it hasn't always been here. It's plants that make oxygen. And before there were plants on the planet, there was no oxygen. What will happen if we take all the plants away? Are we taking all the plants away? Well, yeah, we're working on it. We've already taken away half the forest. Every time we build a building, there are no plants. We can put a lot of plants back, but we need to pay attention to this. It's not just plants that are making oxygen, or plants make oxygen, but that's not the only ecosystem service they deliver. They deliver most of the critical ones, critical ecosystem services to us and also everything else on the planet. Like clean water. When it rains, that water wants to run to the ocean. It's plants that slow down that march to the ocean and permit infiltration that allows the water to infiltrate and recharge our aquifers. If we had no plants on the planet, it'd be all the water would be salty in no time. And while it's doing that, it's cleaning the water. And of course, it's doing all this for free. Plants also build our topsoil and hold it in place. Another critically important ecosystem service. If you take the plants away, the topsoil runs into the ocean. We have bedrock everywhere. It's plants that prevent floods if you keep them in place. As a matter of fact, it's plants that buffer us, well-vegetated ecosystems buffer us from extreme weather events. And we're getting a lot of extreme weather events. So you won't have events that look like this when we keep those plants in our ecosystems. Or if you do, they're far rarer than if you don't. Carbon sequestration, really important ecosystem service these days. This is a ceiba tree in the forests of Costa Rica. It is 600 years old. And it is built out of carbon that has pulled out of the atmosphere, has locked up in its tissues, and is holding that. It's already held that carbon out of harm's way for 600 years. That's a big guy. That's 18 people standing at the base there. So I'm not offering trees as a permanent solution to our carbon woes, but almost a third of the carbon that is now in the atmosphere has come from us removing forests on the planet, chopping down those trees. If we put the trees back, we could pull a third of the carbon out of the atmosphere, and we'd be in much better shape if we did that. This is an easy, at least temporary solution, but I'll take a 600-year solution any day. I'll take a 100-year solution right now. And many of our trees live that long. So we should be putting trees on the planet as fast as possible. Instead, we are still deforesting the planet at a rate of 50,000 acres a day. What do animals do for us? They recycle our garbage. They disperse the seeds of those plants. Critically important ecosystem service to keep these plants going. Particularly our larger woody plants depend on animal seed dispersal. They control our pests. It's insect predators that are controlling most of our insect pests. And they're doing that for free as long as we don't spray and kill them. And they pollinate our plants. 80% of our plants, 90% of our angiosperms are pollinated by animals, not by the wind. So if we lose these pollinators, we're going to lose 80 to 90% of our plants. And believe me, that is not an option. That's just not an option. We also need, there's increasing evidence that we need to interact with other living things, biodiversity, particularly when we're young, for healthy mental development. And this message has come from Richard Louv, who wrote this book, Last Child in the Woods. He coined the term nature deficit disorder. He says our kids are not out playing in nature anymore. At the same time, they're suffering from elevated levels of ADHD and childhood obesity and childhood depression. Maybe there's a relationship between the two. Let's do some research, see if there's a relationship. What are our kids doing? They're doing what we're doing, or we're doing what they're doing. Whatever it is, it's electronic and it's typically inside. Well, Richard Louv also says that our kids are the future stewards of the planet. He says if they don't develop an emotional relationship with the things you're supposed to be stewarding, they're going to be lousy stewards. So he says, let's get the kids out of the house, let them run out in the backyard, turn over the rock, and play with the salamander. That's my granddaughter, so I can say. I couldn't agree more. Get the kids out of the house, let them turn over the rock if there is a rock. But these days we have sterilized our neighborhoods, our living spaces, to the point where there will be no salamander under that rock. We have removed nature from the lives of our kids, from our own lives. We've gone one step further and demonized nature. Now the kids are afraid to go out of the house because something evil will happen to them if they do. Why don't we let the natural areas that still exist in the US and on the planet produce those ecosystem services I was talking about? We can live here and let nature be over there and make all the ecosystem services we need. Well, because There's not enough natural areas left these days. When there weren't that many humans, there were. But of course, as humans grow, natural areas decrease. This is the light map taken by the space shuttle at night. And it just, it gives you a pretty good idea of where humans are in North America. And it's just about everywhere. We've taken 950 million acres of forest east of the Mississippi, virgin forest, chopped it all down, because we were an agrarian society when we got here. But then, after 100 years, 200 years, we weren't an agrarian society anymore. We moved, we're 82% of us in cities now, and many of those forests grew back in what we now call secondary growth. They're good places to be. Many of those trees are 100 years old at this point, but we are still growing. We're adding 5,700 people to the US every day, and those people need a place to live and something to eat, so we're sprawling and cutting down the secondary growth forest. And when I fly home, if it's not cloudy, I will look out, and this is what I see. I see little habitat fragments. So the question becomes, are these habitat fragments big enough to maintain the biodiversity that we need to run the ecosystems that we depend on? Roads, we've got 4 million miles of roads in the US. The surface area, paved surface area of those roadways is equal to 5 times the size of New Jersey, paved over. If pavement was a functioning ecosystem, that wouldn't matter, but it's not. And of course, we have a love affair with the lawn. 72,000 square miles of lawn. We were adding 500 square miles of lawn to the US every year. It's alive, but it's not a functioning, it's not a diverse ecosystem. There's no stability there, and it's not maintaining the biodiversity that creates the services that we need. So the bottom line is, to build landscapes like this, we have usurped so much of the natural world that we can't depend on that to produce those ecosystem services anymore. We're going to have to make them at home, which means we're going to have to live with the nature that makes them. We're going to have to share our spaces. We can do that. How are we doing so far? Well, this is our baseline, at least up where I come from. In developments in southeast Pennsylvania and Maryland and Delaware, we looked at 66 houses in 22 different developments. Houses chosen randomly, and the first thing we've noticed is that 92% of the area that could be landscaped is lawn. So, barren, 92% lawn. Out of the plants that were there, 74% of the species were out-of-towners. 79% of the individual plants were out-of-towners, which means they're not contributing to my chickadee's food web. And 9% of those plants are highly invasive. Not because they've invaded these homeowners' properties, but because homeowners planted them. Things like burning bush and miscanthus and barbarian Bradford pear and all of those guys. So barren landscapes with introduced plants that are not supporting our food webs. We also measure the amount of tree biomass in our neighborhoods. Now, these are not ancient neighborhoods. They were built in 1992, so that's enough time to have some trees in there. But compared to nearby woodlots, only 10% of the tree biomass remains. So in constructing the suburban neighborhoods that we all seem to love so much, we've thrown out 90% of the trees that could be there. We've thrown it right out the window. And that's why when we look out the window, we typically see nothing moving. And we're so used to seeing nothing moving, we think that's normal. We think that's good land stewardship. And now in many places, if we don't landscape in a way where there's nothing moving, we're fined by our civic association because we haven't adopted the deadlock. So yeah, this is what we're talking about. How have we gotten here? What has led us to this? Well, what has led us to this is that we have come to see plants as decorations. So when we go all over the world to look for plants, we're only looking for the most beautiful plants. Why? Because plants are beautiful. They are decorations. But in doing that, we've forgotten all those important ecological services that they perform. I presume there's a family that lives in this house, and if they don't produce all the ecosystem services that they need to live, they're going to have to borrow them if they don't produce them right at home. Can they borrow them from their neighbor? No, because the neighbor's house looks just like that. Can they borrow them from the open space in their township? Typically not, because open spaces, at least where I come from, are golf courses, or they are soccer fields, or they're huge lawns like this with a paved path around it that people walk their dogs. So open space means no building on it, but it doesn't mean it's a productive area. So this homeowner is going to have to produce ecosystem services right here. If they want to make clean water, 92% lawn is not the way to do that, because lawn makes dirty water. And it doesn't encourage infiltration. If they want to sequester carbon, having short-lived ornamental trees, this is our version of Bradford pear or calorie pear. And that's about as big as they get. And in 30 years, they fall over in an ice storm. I've got to go back here and see. I bet those guys are on the ground right now because we had 2 ice storms this summer, and I've seen many of them split up. So they're releasing all the carbon that they just sequestered. And we don't want just 10% of the trees that could be sequestering carbon at home. We need to get a lot more than that at home. And if we want to produce viable food webs, again, I mean, this is what it is. This is my neighbor's house right here. 100% of his plants are out-of-towners, non-native. He's got 10 acres. So no viable food web right there. So this is what I think we need to do. This is how we've chosen plants in the past for their decorative value. And maybe they can be screens or focal points and anchors, but they gotta be beautiful. And we're not gonna get rid of those criteria. Those are important. But let's add what those plants are doing too. How are they functioning in our landscapes, particularly in terms of food web value? Are they contributing to local food webs? Because if they are not, we will have no local food webs and we'll have no biodiversity. We will continue with that deadlock, but that can't go on forever. But they could have all of these and many other really important functions that produce ecosystem services that we all need. Can they be beautiful at the same time? I will argue that they can. And your beautiful live oaks down here demonstrate that better than anything else. Most beautiful tree you've got, and it's producing the most ecosystem services too. So this is how I hope to see the future turn out. We have to ask one last question before we start to wrap this up. We've got parks and preserves. Why are they not big enough? Or why are they not preserving the biodiversity that they were designed in part to do? And the answer to that is that they are not big enough. They are too small. When you take a large habitat and you shrink it down to a small habitat, you're taking large populations of plants and animals in that habitat and shrinking it down to small or tiny populations. And that's the problem. Tiny populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Because all populations fluctuate. We talked about this earlier. In good times they go up, bad times they go down. If you're a large population with many individuals, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population in your down cycle, you often hit 0. Why are you cycling? Because of stochastic events, random events, typically weather events. And this is the problem with the monarch right now. 3.6% of its ancestral population, that's now so tiny that almost any weather event can send them right off the map. So this is a highly precarious state. And there are studies all over the world that are showing that these tiny populations and these tiny habitat fragments are disappearing from those fragments. Our natural areas are not large enough to sustain the nature that we need them to sustain. And that unfortunately includes our largest national parks. So what are we going to do? We need to put the biodiversity back in between the areas in between those parks. That's where we live. So let's talk about how to make a biodiversity-friendly neighborhood. This is the most important thing we need to do. If we build viable habitat in between the isolated habitat fragments, they're not isolated anymore. And if they're not isolated anymore, the populations within them are not tiny anymore. So when they fluctuate, which they will, they won't disappear anymore. Building this connectedness here, these biological corridors right through our yards, is the most important thing we can do to stopping the local drain of species from our local ecosystems. Where are we going to put these areas? I suggest we put them in the area that's in lawn. 45.6 million acres of lawn. 45.6 million acres of status symbol. Let's choose another status symbol. I know we humans need them, but let's choose another one. And put life back in these areas. And we need to build these biological corridors out of the plants that support the life that we're trying to sustain. So if this is the way we used to do it, we used to build the house and we put a flower bed typically right next to the foundation. Then we put in a few trees here and there. And then we're exhausted, no more landscaping. So everything by default becomes lawn. This is the way it is up north anyway. Let's turn that on its head. Let's build the house and now figure out where we do want lawn. Where do we want turf grass? We do want turf grass because it's the perfect plant to walk on without killing it. So we want turf grass where we're going to walk. So think about where you walk or you want to walk in your yard. where grass can guide you around your yard to reconnect you with the living systems that are there. I look at where my neighbors walk with their 10 acres of lawn, nowhere, never outside. But let's say you want to get married in the front yard. You need some lawn there. If you want to walk to the backyard, you need a grass path, throw the frisbee here, have a barbecue. Whatever you want to do, where you're going to use your yard, that's where the grass goes. Then everything else by default becomes heavily planted. Tall plants in the back, short plants in the front. And this is such a landscape design paradigm shift that it becomes the landscape design challenge of our times. Do we have landscape designers here, anybody? Yeah. Go ahead, you can raise your hand. The ball is in your park. How do we get all these plants in our yard without them looking wild and messy? Because we know that people don't like wild and messy, but we can do it. All the arboretums have done it. And it'll change the culture. It will be normal to have plants in our lives instead of bare lawn. And if we convince our neighbors to do the same thing, then we've got the connectivity I'm talking about. That'll connect with the woodlot down here and the woodlot over here, and it'll stop that steady species drain. We still get to play with our lawnmowers. It'll be okay. And if we do that in half the area that's in lawn, we don't have to be draconian about it. Let's take 40 million acres and cut it in half. We can create a new national park that'll be 20 million acres in size. We're going to do this at home, so we'll call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park is going to be the biggest national park by far. Let's take areas that look like this and turn them into beautiful areas that you can certainly relate to. Let's take this mulch sculpture and turn it into something that's living, that will require far less maintenance, believe me. This is a corporate landscape that is designed to invite the employees out at noon to get sunburned. Let's turn it into something like this. There is research that shows if you spend just 15 minutes walking around a landscape like this, there are measurable medical benefits. Your blood pressure drops, your stress hormone, the cortisol in your blood drops, your cancer is cured, you don't get divorced anymore, all kinds of benefits happen. And if you're interested it's a very active area of research. Richard Liu's second book, called The Nature Principle, summarizes this research as of 2 years ago, if you're interested in that. Does that mean your yard has to be 100% native for all of this to happen? No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that at all. But I just want you to understand what each plant in your yard is doing and what it's not doing. I gave a talk in Norfolk, Virginia, about 3 weeks ago, and I drove down the eastern shore of Maryland, down across the Bay Bridge, and it's a single road down, and lining that road all the way down are crepe myrtles, and I counted them as I went, 35 million. That was before I got to North or South Carolina, where it's 200 zillion. But, why? Because crepe myrtle's a beautiful plant. It's got beautiful bark, beautiful flowers, but you know what? It's not contributing anything to our local food webs. So what is something that's beautiful but essentially biologically inert? I always think of a statue when I think of something like that. So the question is, how many statues do we want in our yard? 1 or 2 is okay. But a landscape full of statues just doesn't look right. So why do we want native plants in our gardens? These are reasons that have been suggested. Let's look at each one of them. We want native plants because it gives us a sense of place. And they would indeed, if we landscaped in a way that represented the biome that we all live in, we could know where we live, we could understand it and feel part of that land. That's what a sense of place is. And to some people that's important, but you know what, to most people, they don't care. I have driven across the country a couple times with my wife, and every time we stop to get gas, we go into the nearest neighborhood and I take a picture. And from here to Portland, Oregon, because that's where our grandkids are, every development looks identical. We have the same small palette of plants. They're from Asia. So nobody's celebrating a sense of place. I don't think that's going to work. It's not because native plants are prettier than non-native plants. You all know we've got gorgeous non-native plants because we have scoured the world looking for the prettiest ones. It's not a fair comparison. We also have pretty native plants, but we can't make that argument in a convincing way. Now these 3 have been applied to me personally. I like native plants because I'm nostalgic for the past. I don't know. I do watch I Love Lucy once in a while. Because I oppose change. No. I'm going to fight that one. People tell me all the time, you know, ecosystems change naturally. Change is natural. Stop fighting it. Change is natural, but not at the rate at which we're changing these ecosystems. We're changing them in ecological time almost overnight. The last time our ecosystems changed as fast as we're changing them right now is when the asteroid hit 66 million years ago, and that wasn't pleasant. So the rate of change is not at all natural, and I will fight that. And it's not, I don't like natives because I dislike foreigners. That's called nativism. No, that's not the reason. The reason is we need native plants because we need ecosystem function. And this is, that's not debatable. We need ecosystem function. And it is native plants that are going to give us the function that we need the most, because they're the ones with those specialized relationships that I focused on in the beginning of the talk. So we can save nature if we embrace those specialized relationships that are nature. And of course, we need to save nature to save ourselves. Let me end with one story about the Tala Butterfly. Some of you probably know this already because this is a story from Florida, from southern Florida. The residential neighborhoods of southern Florida have saved this species from extinction. And the interesting part about this is that it was an accident. It was an accident. That's the Tala butterfly. It's a lycaenid butterfly that is beautiful as an adult. It is beautiful as a larva. It is beautiful as a chrysalis. And like the other species that I talked about tonight, this guy's a host plant specialist. Only this is an extreme specialist. It eats one species of plant, the coontie. And I was shown many wonderful plantings of coontie today, so you guys know about coontie. It is a native cycad. I thought it was restricted to southern Florida, but apparently it occurs up here as well. But it has an interesting history in itself. The Seminole Indians used to use coontie roots as a source of starch. They'd pull it up by the roots and pound those roots into a starchy paste. Then they'd add it to their food. And when the settlers came, they taught them how to do the same thing. The settlers loved coontie, so they ate a lot of it. Then they said, let's make a starch industry out of coontie. And I think it was the 1912 census in Miami. There was something like only 20,000 people in Miami then, and 75% of them put down that they were starch gatherers. So we ate and removed all of the coontie from Florida, from nature anyway. And of course, if you take away the coontie, which is the only host plant of the Atala, you take away the Atala. There were desperate attempts to get this butterfly listed as an endangered species when the Endangered Species Act came out in 1974, but nobody could find any Atala, and that's one of the rules. You have to have something in order to save it. So instead, they got it listed as extinct. But that was about the time when designers and landscape architects, the landscaping industry in general, recognized coontie as a valuable landscape plant. It's a low-growing evergreen shrub that does well in the sandy soils of Florida. So it was promoted and was planted in southern Florida. It's planted up here. I didn't realize that. And lo and behold, the coontie, or the Tala butterfly showed up again. Only in the south so far. There must have been a remnant population deep in the Everglades that nobody knew about. So nobody knows where it came from, but it is colonizing those residential plantings of coontie. And now there are many places where it's quite common. So what I really like about this story is that the fact that it really was an accident. They never did get it listed as an endangered species. They didn't spend one dime of conservation money trying to save it, which is good because they didn't have one dime of conservation money. But simply by adding a single plant to the palette of plants that they use in residential plantings, they were able to pull the species back from extinction. So if you can do that by accident, think what we could do if we made conservation a goal of our home plantings. So fortunately, nature's gonna make this easy for us. It's malleable, it's resilient, it is quite forgiving, and it will give us one last chance if we pay attention to those specialized relationships I talked about. Thank you very much.